All right, here we go. Holes chapter 3. Before we get into that, let's go ahead and take a look at the cover of my book. This is the cover. You can see it was a Newbery winner, Louis Sachar. It's like a cracker, Louis Sachar. Really neat cover. I've always liked this cover. You can see all the holes. Depth's not really that good, but it's at night. You can tell by the cover there. I also love this picture here. I've always had a fun discussion with the kids about this cover as we go. So we'll talk about this as we go, kind of that look he has on his face, and we try to figure out who this really is. Is this Stanley or is this one of the other characters? Cover page. It is a scholastic book. And of course, what I didn't mention about chapter 1 is that it's actually the first part. You are entering Camp Green Lake. So it gives you even a little bit of foreshadowing with that title. Part 1, you are entering Camp Green Lake. All right, chapter 3. Stanley Yelnats was the only passenger on the bus, not counting the driver or the guard. The guard sat next to the driver with his seat turned around facing Stanley. A rifle lay across his lap. Stanley was sitting about 10 rows back, handcuffed to his armrest. His backpack lay on the seat next to him. It contained his toothbrush, toothpaste, and a box of stationery his mother had given him. A good vocabulary word, by the way, stationery. I mean, I think we all know what it is, but word that you might want to keep in the back of your head. Good word. He'd promised to write to her at least once a week, and you can use context there to kind of figure out what stationery means. Again, think about, he's sitting there, this guy's got a gun laying across his lap. This is Stanley. We don't know much about him yet, but obviously this isn't a normal camp. Also, setting on this bus, time and place. Think about that. Page 6 for me. Some of you have different books. He looked out the window, although there wasn't much to see, mostly fields of hay and cotton. He was on a long bus ride to nowhere. The bus wasn't air-conditioned, and the hot, heavy air was almost as stifling as the handcuffs. Another great vocabulary word, stifling. Stanley and his parents had tried to pretend that he was just going away to camp for a while, just like rich kids do. When Stanley was younger, he used to play with stuffed animals and pretend the animals were camp. Camp fun and games, he called it. Sometimes he'd have them play soccer with a marble. Other times they'd run an obstacle course or go bungee jumping off a table tied to broken rubber bands. Now Stanley tried to pretend he was going to Camp Fun and Games. Maybe he'd make some friends, he thought. At least he'd get to swim in a lake. Now, we already know that's not true because we talked about the lake in the first chapter. He didn't have any friends at home. He was overweight, and the kids at his middle school often teased him about his size. Even his teachers sometimes made cruel comments without realizing it. On his last day of school, his math teacher, Mrs. Bell, taught ratios. As an example, she chose the heaviest kid in the class and the lightest kid in the class and had them weigh themselves. Stanley weighed 3 times as much as the other boy. Mrs. Bell wrote the ratio on the board, 3-to-1, unaware of how much embarrassment she had caused both of them. So think about that. Think about the teacher. Think about poor Stanley standing there, and even the small kid standing there. She's pointing out things that they may be embarrassed about without really thinking it through. Not very level 6. And of course, Stanley was arrested later that day. So did that play a part in it? I guess we'll find out. Maybe, that was kind of something that made him angry. I don't know. He looked at the guard who sat slumped in his seat and wondered if he had fallen asleep. The guard was wearing sunglasses, so Stanley couldn't see his eyes. Stanley was not a bad kid. He was innocent of the crime for which he was convicted. Usually doesn't tell us on page 7. Now we know he's innocent. He'd just been in the wrong place at the wrong time. It was all because of his no good, dirty, rotten, pig-stealing, great-great-grandfather. He smiled. It was a family joke. Whenever anything went wrong, they always blamed Stanley's no good, dirty, rotten, pig stealing, great grandfather. My kids were supposed to jump in on that, but they haven't figured it out yet. Whenever we read the book, everybody always says it. My daughter's class did it. James's class did it. Apparently, they don't do it when they're at home. Supposedly, he had a great-great-grandfather who had stolen a pig from a one-legged gypsy. And she put a curse on him and all his descendants. Stanley and his parents didn't believe in curses, of course, but whenever anything went wrong, it felt good to be able to blame someone. Things went wrong a lot. They always seemed to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. He looked out the window at the vast emptiness. He watched the rise and fall of a telephone wire. In his mind, he could hear his father's gruff voice softly saying to him, if only, the woodpecker sighs. The bark on the tree was just a little bit softer, while the wolf waits below, hungry and lonely. He cries to the moo-oo-oon, if only, if only. It was a song his father used to sing to him. The melody was sweet and sad, but Stanley's favorite part was when his father would howl the word moo-oo-oon. The bus hit a small bump and the guard sat up, instantly alert. Stanley's father was an inventor. To be a successful inventor, you need 3 things: intelligence, perseverance, and just a little bit of luck. Stanley's father was smart, and he had a lot of perseverance. Great word. Once he started a project, he would work on it for years, often going days without sleep. He just never had any luck. Every time an experiment failed, Stanley could hear him cursing his dirty, rotten, pig-stealing great-grandfather. Of course, it's not great-great-grandfather because that's Stanley, so his dad would be great-grandfather. Put it together. Stanley's father was also named Stanley Yelnats. Stanley's father's full name was Stanley Yelnats III. Our Stanley is Stanley Yelnats IV. Everyone in his family has always liked the fact that Stanley Yelnats was spelled the same frontward and backward, so they kept naming their son Stanley. Stanley was an only child, as was every other Stanley Yelnats before him. All of them had something else in common. Despite their awful luck, they always remained hopeful. As Stanley's father liked to say, I learn from failure. Boom, theme. Right there. I learn from failure. Okay? And also think about the level of person who understands that it's okay to fail and always have hope. So think of that. Think of our saying, offer hope. Also think of our levels. But perhaps that was part of the curse as well. If Stanley and his father weren't always hopeful, then it wouldn't hurt so much every time their hopes were crushed. Not every Stanley Yelnats has been a failure, Stanley's mother often points out. Whenever Stanley or his father became so discouraged that they actually started to believe in the curse, the first Stanley Yelnats, Stanley's great-grandfather, had made a fortune in the stock market. He couldn't have been too unlucky. At such times, she neglected to mention the bad luck that befell the first Stanley Yelnats. He lost his entire fortune when he was moving from New York to California. His stagecoach was robbed by the outlaw, Kissin' Kate Barlow. If it weren't for that, Stanley's family would now be living in a mansion on a beach in California. Instead, they were crammed in a tiny apartment that smelled of burning rubber and foot odor. If only, if only. The apartment smelled the way it did because Stanley's father was trying to invent a way to recycle old sneakers. The first person who finds a use for old sneakers, he said, will be a very rich man. It was the latest project that led to Stanley's arrest. The bus ride became increasingly bumpy because the road was no longer paved. Actually, Stanley had been impressed when he first found out that his great-grandfather was robbed by Kissin' Kate Barlow. True, he would have preferred living on the beach in California, but it was still kind of cool to have someone in your family robbed by a famous outlaw. Kate Barlow didn't actually kiss Stanley's great-grandfather. That would have been really cool. But she only kissed the men she killed. Instead, she robbed him and left him stranded in the middle of a desert. He was lucky to have survived, Stanley's mother was quick to point out. The bus was slowing down. The guard grunted as he stretched his arms. "Welcome to Camp Green Lake," said the driver. Stanley looked out the dirty window. he couldn't see a lake, and hardly anything was green. More irony. Think about how they were tying in like backstory about his family, his great-grandfather, his great-great-grandfather, his dad, kind of intermingled in this traveling along the way, on the way to Camp Green Lake, which isn't green or doesn't have a lake. Odd name, right? Guess we'll find out in the next chapter a little bit more. See you then.